Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 14, Corruption and Autocratic Control in the Unions. The new orientation is accompanied by more traditional forms of betrayal. In the industries, the reactionary trade union leaders sacrifice and compromise the workers' interests, retail and wholesale, in innumerable ways. They confine the unions chiefly to skilled workers, in many cases refusing to recognize the unskilled workers and trading off their interests for the sake of the skilled. Often they transform the unions into job trusts, charging extravagant initiation fees and barring from membership with one device or another many workers of their own trades. All too frequently they actually sell out strikes for cash. They discriminate against Negroes, women, and the youth in the industries and in the unions. Often they also first drive the workers into outlaw strikes and dual unions by neglecting their interests, and then, with the aid of the employers and the state, ruthlessly smash such movements. They wipe out all semblances of democracy in the unions. For fear of losing their jobs, they refuse to amalgamate the weak craft organizations into industrial unions. To further the interest of their respective craft unions at the expense of other workers, they engage in deadly and stupid jurisdictional wars. They often go over to the boss's organizations after they lose their official union positions and use the knowledge, skill, and prestige that they gained in the ranks of the workers against the unions. All of which policies, neglect, and treachery constitute, in plain English, flagrant and far-reaching betrayal of the workers. An especially disastrous form of working-class betrayal is union scabbery, that is, where the leaders keep one or more unions in an industry at work while others strike. This degrading practice of union scabbery, which is more prevalent in the United States than in any other country, has lost the workers hundreds of strikes and has spread incalculable demoralization in their ranks. In numberless cases where, for example, the machinists struck, the union boilermakers stayed at work. Where the carpenters went out, the organized bricklayers remained at the job. Where the longshoremen tried to tie up the docks, the union sailors manned the ships loaded by scabs. Where the printers struck, the pressmen stayed at work. And where the railroad firemen declared a strike, the engineers stuck at work and helped the employers break in, and vice versa, in practically all the industries. And of course, there is also endless scabbing between the industries. The railroad workers haul coal produced by scab miners. The miners produce coal for scab railroads, scab steel mills, etc. The trade union leaders have done nothing to check this shameful system of mutual betrayal by the unions. On the contrary, their system of leadership being based upon it, they have clung to it and bitterly resisted every effort of the rank and file to force a consolidation of the labor organizations and to develop a real solidarity of labor. And finally, there is the utter and shameful betrayal exemplified by the labor detective, the undercover man of the employers. Mulhall exposed many of these degraded creatures who were often degenerate trade union officials. Sidney Howard and Robert W. Dunn, in their book The Labor Spy, show how the whole contemptible system works and paint graphic pictures of many of these sorry heroes. The corrupt practices which flourish unchecked in the unions contribute largely to producing these labor spies who, well placed and influential, infest the trade unions in astonishing numbers. When a trade union official takes money from a capitalist politician for misleading the workers in election times, or when he accepts a bribe from an employer for calling off a strike, and great numbers have done and are doing both, he is on a toboggan of corruption which may easily carry him to the very lowest depths of treachery to the working class, even to actually spying. Trade unions and graft. Towards all this corruption and graft, the general policy of the leaders in the trade unions has been to pass it over in silence. The false argument is made that if it is exposed, it will injure the labor movement. This idea is carefully propagated by the reactionary officialdom, and large numbers of the rank and file are deceived by it. As for the grafters themselves, they interpret this policy of silence as giving them a free hand to carry on their destructive activities. Rarely has the labor bureaucracy itself taken the initiative in exposing the corrupt leaders. Usually this is done by the left wing. Sometimes even the employers expose them. After they have been exposed, the unions sometimes expel them. Otherwise, the whole practice of grafting on the workers and employers is tolerated and condoned. The disease of corruption goes on untreated. A search of the history, encyclopedia, and reference book of AFL brings forth on page 161 the following lone action taken on the question of bribery by the AFL. Bribe taking, 1903, page 202. An isolated case of bribe taking does not warrant the conclusion that dishonesty on the part of the officers of organized labor prevails. On the contrary, we are convinced that the representatives of organized labor are by far the most reliable, honest, and trustworthy of any walk of life. The reason for this failure to attack the grafters is plain. The right-wing machine in the AFL bases itself, and has for a generation, upon the most corrupt and reactionary elements in the labor movement. 1/3 of the entire membership of the AFL belongs to the building trade unions, where corruption is at its worst. Their delegations at AFL conventions are solidly reactionary. Their leaders, in combination with the bourbon heads of the printing trades and the miners' unions, form the body of the reactionary AFL bureaucracy. Gompers always protected the grafters. He himself apparently did not take money from the employers, nor did he accept their many offers of political positions. He got his reward for his treason to the workers by being maintained as president of the AFL, where he basked in friendly publicity and lived as a wealthy man. All the worst labor fakers gave him their active support. For years it was axiomatic that the more of a labor faker, the more of a Gompersite. Skinny Madden, Sam Parks, Simon O'Donnell, Frank Feeney, Robert Brindle, Matthew Wool, George L. Berry, all were Gomper's bosom friends and co-workers. On their kind his rule was based. Whenever and wherever building trade fakers were exposed, Gompers never failed to defend them to the last. Likewise in other industries. In the 1920 convention of the AFL, Mahan, head of the Street Carmen's Union, was accused correctly by the Detroit Federation of Labor of running an open shop sheet metal works in Detroit, but the charges were smothered and Mahan was whitewashed. Characteristically, Gompers, in his book 70 Years of Life and Labor, thus defends the traitorous conduct of the steelworkers' leaders, Jarrett, Bishop, Way, Nutt, and others, in going over to the employers, saying, "It was not that they were corrupted, but they were weaned away. The organization paid them very meager salaries, less indeed than that of a first-class man in the industry." Volume 1, page 340. Is graft diminishing in the building trades? This is a difficult question. Some factors appear to make against it in its old forms. The employers, becoming constantly more trustified, have less and less need of the trade union leaders' cooperation for the maintenance of hard and fast local monopolies of labor and material which exclude outside competition. And it is upon such illegitimate cooperation that the typical building trades graft system is largely based. Moreover, the growing strength of the employers and the breaking down of the skilled trades through specialization tend to weaken the position of the building trade unions and make it somewhat more difficult for the venal officers to carry on their traditional policy of wholesale plunder. But, whether increasing or decreasing, the building trades graft is practiced on a wide scale, and it poisons and demoralizes the whole labor movement. Bourgeois labor leaders. There is a strong tendency, universal in capitalist countries, for the trade union leadership to develop certain group interests of its own, antagonistic to those of the workers. The leaders tend sharply, by their manner of living and by their general outlook, to become to all intents and purposes a section of the lower middle class. The labor official of today, with his private fortune, fancy automobiles, aristocratic apartments, and extensive business interests, is a very different type from the men who laid their basis of our trade union movement. Debs thus describes the pioneer trade unionist. The labor agitator of the early day held no office, had no title, drew no salary, saw no footlights, heard no applause, never saw his name in print, and fills an unknown grave. The labor movement is his monument, and though his name is not inscribed upon it, his soul is in it, and with it marches on forever. Mother Jones, champion of the workers, makes this comparison. Many of our modern leaders of labor have wandered far from the thorny path of these early crusaders. Never in the early days of the labor struggle would you find leaders dining and wining with the aristocracy, nor did their wives strut about like diamond-bedecked peacocks, nor were they attended by humiliated, cringing servants. The wives of those early leaders took in washing to make ends meet. Their children picked and sold berries. The women shared the heroism, the privation of their husbands. In those days, labor's representatives did not sit on velvet chairs in conference with labor's oppressors. They did not dine in fashionable hotels with the representatives of the top capitalists, such as the Civic Federation. They did not ride in Pullmans nor make trips to Europe. The rank and file have let their servants become their masters and dictators. The workers have now to fight not alone their exploiters, but likewise their own leaders, who often betray them, sell them out, who put their own advancement ahead of that of the working masses. In 1887, Parsons, Spies, Engel, and Fisher, breathing the spirit of the pioneer American labor movement, went bravely to the gallows. They were of the type described above so eloquently by Debs. Their fighting spirit and self-sacrificing devotion still live in the left wing, but the official labor leaders now know it no more, except to hate it and to crush it. The modern top trade union leaders are pampered servants of capitalism, well-paid betrayers of the working class. Their aims and ideals have been divorced from those of the rank and file. Their prime purpose is to advance their own interests regardless of those of the workers. That is why, as William E. Trotman once said, they have made America the land of lost strikes. This conservative trade union leadership, seeking first of all to protect its fat sinecures, has distinct group if not class interest in conflict with those of the workers. The rank and file want the amalgamation of their unions because it would strengthen them for struggle against the employers. The officials oppose it because it would, by upsetting the present balances of power and by possibly cutting the number of jobs, knock some of them out of their well-paid positions. Likewise, these misleaders of labor oppose the formation of a labor party because it would compel the severance of their present illicit alliances with the capitalist parties and force them into the hard task of building up a mass party of labor. They reject a policy of militant struggle against the employers because all their group interests lead them to develop friendly relations and collaboration with the exploiters of the workers. Between the interests of the mass of American organized labor and those of their leaders, a vast chasm yawns. Naturally, the well-paid trade union leaders exert every effort to retain their positions against the strivings of other hungry office seekers and in the face of rank-and-file revolts. Michels, in his Political Parties, explains in great detail the many devices used by social democratic bureaucrats to maintain themselves in office during the days before the World War, making themselves technically apparently indispensable, transforming temporary positions into permanent ones, playing themselves up in the organization press and playing down their opponents, exploiting the loyalty of the masses for men who have long served as their officials, making concessions to rival leaders and broadening the bureaucratic base to accommodate them, manipulating the finances in various petty ways, developing a rigid centralism, overstepping the mandates of the rank and file, and generally playing upon the weaknesses inherent in every democratic mass organization of workers. But American trade union leaders use not only most of the tricks that Michels touches upon, but many more of which he never dreamed. To hang on to their jobs, they appeal to the gun and knife. They make open alliances with the employers and the state against the workers, and they ruthlessly suppress democracy in the organizations. Many of their methods are more akin to those of fascism than to legitimate labor unionism, and more such methods are also being applied in other countries. With the developing of the new American reformism, that is, the orientation of the labor bureaucrats toward intensified class collaboration, their methods of hanging on to control of the unions become more drastic and desperate. As the leaders drift to the right and enter more and more into cooperation with the employers, inevitably they more flagrantly sacrifice and betray the interests of the rank and file. Consequently, widespread discontent develops in the many unions, especially in those containing masses of semi-skilled and unskilled. The membership begins to listen to the voice of the left wing. Therefore, the bureaucrats, in order to avoid disaster to themselves through rank-and-file revolts, must crush by force the left wing, which leads these revolts and which they cannot defeat in free debate before the workers. To fight back the growing discontent, no means are too drastic for them to use. None are impermissible, even to actually destroying the unions. The bureaucrats sharpen up and use with added vigor all the traditional means of autocratic control, and they invent new ones. Suppression of union democracy. To control the unions, the reactionaries have built up many powerful bureaucratic machines. These are constructed upon various lines. The AFL itself is ruled by a well-knit clique, the foundations of which were laid by Gompers. The great power of Gompers and his extended control were due in very large part to the policy he followed of closely protecting the craft autonomy and reactionary practices of the international unions affiliated to the AFL. He was an inveterate enemy of all the tendencies to centralize power in the hands of the AFL proper. He jealously guarded the rights of the bureaucrats of the respective unions, except where he helped some powerful union to put pressure on a small one. Thus they came to look upon him and to organize around him as a safe man, as one who would not permit the central mechanism of the labor movement to infringe upon them. His policy was centralization of the individual international unions and decentralization of the AFL itself. He grew strong personally by keeping the AFL weak and unprogressive. He was a king enormously popular among his nobles because he allowed them to do as they pleased in their respective domains. In the various international unions, there exist many established cliques, formed for the purpose of offsetting democratic checks and for controlling the official positions. Usually these groups, without formal names or organization, are simple understandings of the bureaucrats to stick together. They use the union funds freely to advance their clique interests. Occasionally, these groups take on definite forms. The Juanetas of the Typographical Union are perhaps the best example. This reactionary group, with scores of nuclei throughout the country, was organized to control the Printers' Union, and it succeeded well until the opposition built the still better organized Progressive Party. Often cliques build themselves around fraternal orders, such as the Masons, Elks, etc. The Catholic Church also has its organized following in many unions, especially among the higher-ups. The responsiveness of the AFL to Catholic Church program is one of the reasons why Catholic unions were never built in this country. Formerly, the Socialist Party had many groupings in the unions, but now, when its grip in the unions is restricted to the needle trades, the daily forward machinery is the basis of its organization. The recently formed Committee for the Preservation of Trade Unions was an attempt of the Socialist Party to rebuild its groups throughout the labor movement. In view of the many groups and cliques of the reactionaries, which universally finance themselves with the union's money, it comes with poor grace from them to make their present big outcry at the formation of rank-and-file groups by the left wing. To maintain themselves in office and to defeat the rank-and-file control, the corrupt bureaucrats systematically seek to destroy the convention as a democratic instrument in the unions. Many are their devices, and as the bureaucracy drifts to the right and rank-and-file revolts become more intense, these devices grow bolder and more fascist-like. The AFL convention is the classical illustration of a labor gathering in which the rank-and-file have no say. The delegation is made up almost entirely of upper bureaucrats. For example, the United Mine Workers, UMWA, representing some 300,000 workers, has 8 delegates. These usually consist of the president, vice president, secretary, and 5 district presidents of the organization. The rank and file are completely shut out. The same system prevails in almost all of the other international unions. The only place a worker gets a look in at the AFL convention is as a stray delegate from a federal labor union or petty central labor council. Such a convention, completely in the hands of the corrupt bureaucracy, is a fortress of reaction. In the international unions, various schemes of disproportionate representation are used to disenfranchise the majority of the membership. For example, at the recent convention of the ILGWU, the Sigmund machine held a majority of delegates, although the opposition represented 2/3 of the entire union membership. Thus, at this convention, the right-wing per capita tax proposal of 15 cents carried by a vote of 146 delegates, representing 15,832 actual members against 114 delegates, representing 34,762 actual members. Approximately this same vote prevailed throughout. It was manifestly a minority-ruled convention. Sigmund formerly controlled the New York Joint Board, the heart of the union, by a similar jugglery. The left controlled 4 big locals with a membership of 36,000, for which they had 20 delegates, whereas the rights, who controlled a number of smaller locals totaling only 20,000, had 38 delegates. After the bitter Joint Action Committee fight in 1925, which defeated Sigmund, partial proportional representation was introduced in the Joint Board. The left secured a majority. Similar democracy prevails in the other socialist needle unions. The reactionaries at the head of the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers control that organization by means of a lot of nondescript delegates from the little locals all over the country, many of them merely on paper. The usual thing at its conventions is for the progressives, coming from the larger locals and representing a majority of the membership, to find themselves very much in a minority. George L. Berry, like the heads of many other unions, uses this same system of basing his control upon the small-town locals. When the convention assembles, Berry, in the orthodox manner of Hutchinson and others, makes his control doubly sure by appointing all the convention committees. In fact, he appoints many of the delegates as well. Not content even with such means of control, the bureaucrats in many unions seek systematically to have fewer and fewer conventions. The hod carriers have had only 2 conventions since that union was organized in 1903. Formerly, the carpenters held conventions annually. Now they hold them every 4 years. Almost every international has its conventions at greater intervals than formerly. A favorite method to eliminate conventions is to make them so costly by paying the big delegations extravagant per diem expenses that the union with its regular funds cannot afford them. Then when the rank and file vote on the holding of a convention, they also have to vote an assessment on themselves to finance it. So they usually vote no convention. The cost of the Railroad Brotherhood's conventions run up as high as $1 million. The officials take care also to see that the conventions degenerate into pleasure junkets with constant rounds of entertainments so that there will be little thought of constructive work by the delegates. Thus many an opposition movement has been defeated. The conventions of the United Mine Workers are tragic examples of the suppression of union democracy. Lewis's task always is to build up a convention majority from a union membership which is from 60% to 75% against him. To do this, he packs the convention shamelessly. He brings in the payroll vote, at least 300 delegates from far and wide. Then he rigs up the delegates from hundreds of blue sky locals. At the 1927 convention, he had 166 delegates from West Virginia, where the Union had only 337 actual members. Delegations from other districts were similarly packed. Opposition delegates, especially the capable speakers, were ruthlessly ruled out. Speakers were terrorized by professional gunmen. If in spite of such precautions a majority does vote against Lewis in a convention, he brazenly ignores it. At the 1924 convention, he did this 4 times. When it comes to stealing elections, Tammany Hall politicians are no more brazen than the trade union bureaucrats. Every conceivable form of fraud is practiced. Many a reactionary leader has thus saved his bacon from an aroused rank and file. In the recent national election in the Carpenters Union, Hutchison canceled many votes to build up a majority against Brown and Rosen. The recent machinist national election was also marked by gross frauds, and the only way Jensen could elect himself head of the Chicago Carpenters District Council in the recent election was by arbitrarily throwing out the vote of one local union. The opposition had no appeal except either to the reactionary Hutchison or to the capitalist courts, both equally hopeless. Umbrella Mike Boyle varies such methods by falsifying the voting machines borrowed from the city by the Union. In the 1924 elections in the Bookbinders Union, the official figures gave Reddick the election over Haggerty by 5,575 against 5,117. It was later proved in court, however, that Reddick had stolen enough votes in Local 25 of New York alone, not to mention others, to swing the elections. Reddick is a crony of Berry's. One practice of reactionaries is to evade inconvenient elections altogether by having themselves elected for life. Skinny Madden started with this. William Neer of the Chicago Milk Wagon Drivers and many other reactionaries are continuing it by electing themselves heads of their unions in perpetuity. In the unions of highly skilled workers, the reactionaries get by easier in elections and do not usually need to use the grossest frauds. It is especially in the organization of semi-skilled and unskilled that such methods are found at their worst. The miners' union is the horrible example. Thus, during the 1926 elections in Kansas, Howitt, who had 90% of the miners behind him, was simply removed from the ballot by Lewis and votes cast for him were not counted. Farrington was brazen in Illinois. He stole votes right and left. At one local union meeting, backed up by his strong-arm men, he boldly declared, "I do not give a damn whether you vote for me or not. As long as I carry a card in the miners' union, I'll be president of District 12. In the 1926 election in District 5 Pittsburgh, the opposition candidate, Siders, was clearly elected, but Fagan, the Lewis man, blithely stole the election by padding the returns and by voting non-existent blue sky locals. Such corruption is, of course, always sustained by the International Office if appeal is made against it. But the election frauds reached their climax in the national elections in the miners' union. In earlier years, John H. Walker, at the time a socialist, several times was robbed of the election. Alex Howitt was also beaten by the fraudulent casting of more than 50,000 votes in the semi-organized districts. After the 1924 convention, Lewis officially claimed to have defeated Voisey, a rank-and-file communist miner, by a vote of 134,000 to 66,000. Wholesale frauds were practiced by Lewis. Voisey was undoubtedly elected. Lewis had never ventured to issue a tabulated report of the vote, as required by the Union Constitution. The 1927 miners' election exhibited similar frauds. Lewis officially claimed 173,000 votes as against 60,000 for Brophy. This would make a total of 223,000 votes cast for an actual membership of 273,000, a manifest fraud, as returns from hundreds of locals assembled by the left wing showed that not more than one-third of the miners actually voted. Lewis stole votes wholesale, both for himself and from Brophy. In District 30, Kentucky, which has no actual dues-paying members, 2,686.5 votes were reported cast for Lewis and none for Brophy, a clear steal. In District 31, West Virginia, with an average of 377 dues payers, 14,000 votes were stolen for Lewis. In District 19, Tennessee, with only 482 real members, 3,962 votes were reported for Lewis and 15 for Brophy. In the Pittsburgh district, one-third of the locals voting had no existence except on paper. In all the other districts, similar large-scale vote padding and stealing went on. Brophy, like Voise, was certainly elected. Lewis, holding on to the power Mussolini fashion, refuses to yield to majority votes. He has killed the one-time firm opinion of the left wing that the referendum election is a specific cure for autocratic union control. When labor union bureaucrats find themselves, in spite of all their tricks of control, confronted with definite instructions to apply militant and progressive policies, they unhesitatingly violate the mandates of their rank and file, trusting to the general inertia of the mass to escape punishment for their treachery. The history of the labor movement is full of such instances. During 1922-24, the Great TUEL movement for amalgamation swept through the trade unions. 17 state federations and 9 international unions, besides scores of central bodies and thousands of local unions, adopted resolutions calling upon the AFL Executive Council to hold conferences to lay the basis for amalgamation. The council blithely ignored the whole demand, though it represented more than half of the entire labor movement. A case in point during the big amalgamation drive occurred in the railway Carmen. Lodge 299 of Minneapolis submitted for referendum a proposition to commit the union to amalgamation. The proposal was regular in every respect, having 10 times the required number of local union endorsements. It would have carried overwhelmingly if the rank and file had been allowed to vote on it, but the national officials swept it aside with a technical objection and refused to let the members vote on it. Thereupon, Lodge 299 resubmitted its proposition with at least 20 times the required endorsements. This time, the officialdom suppressed it without any excuse, refusing to send it out for a referendum vote, although the Constitution gives them no option but to send out all such proposals. Result: the proposition was strangled. At the 1923 convention of the AFL, fully 50% of the delegates came from unions which, during the prevailing Great Progressive stir among the workers, had voted for amalgamation, the Labour Party, and recognition of Soviet Russia. Yet all 3 of these measures were voted down practically unanimously at the convention. In the same way, the railroad union bureaucrats ignored and defeated the demands of 2/3 of their membership for the amalgamation of the railroad unions following the disastrous 1922 railroad shopmen's strike. When Simon O'Donnell was defeated in his unions as delegate to the Chicago Building Trades Council, of which he was president, it was, under the Constitution, tantamount to his removal from office. But his building trade cliques quickly adopted a rule that it was not necessary to be a delegate in order to be president of the council. Similar instances of violation of constitutions and rank-and-file mandates should be cited indefinitely. The trade union leaders are wide awake to the value of the labor press as an instrument for the propagation of their reactionary doctrines and the perpetuation of their personal power. Consequently, it is a settled policy of theirs to reduce the various trade union papers, which once made a real show at freedom for rank-and-file expression, into mere house organs to advance the fortunes of the particular ruling cliques. In many unions, there is not even a semblance of press freedom. Ideas and programs not acceptable to the dominant bureaucrats are unceremoniously thrown into the wastebasket. Oppositional movements are almost completely barred from expression in such journals. Often even official action by big sections of the organizations does not suffice to break the embargo. This suppression of free rank-and-file expression in the union journals is one of the greatest bars to the progress of the labor movement. As the trade union bureaucracy drifts more to the right, it fights ever more viciously to prevent the left wing from mobilizing the discontented rank and file against it. Therefore, the reactionaries apply constantly more drastically the foregoing autocratic methods of control, and in the growing struggle against the rank-and-file upheavals, new dictatorial methods have been added. Most of these have originated in the socialist needle trade unions, where the fight between the rights and lefts is sharpest. One of such relatively new schemes is the arbitrary disenfranchisement of the opposition. In the reactionary boot and shoe workers union, the practice has long been followed of placing rebellious members in the so-called local O, where they have no rights of voting or attending union meetings, but it remained for the needle trades leaders to bring this system to its maximum. In all the needle unions, they have reduced many left-wingers to a state of semi-membership, denying them many of the constitutional rights of the union, especially is this method used during elections. Scores of times the controlling bureaucrats, with the most trivial excuses or with none at all, have simply refused to place left-wing opposition candidates on the election ballot. This nefarious practice is being adopted by the reactionary leaders of many other unions, especially among the miners, where it was used extensively in many districts during the recent elections. The favorite method of the reactionaries, however, is outright expulsion of left-wing leaders from the unions. In earlier years, American labor bureaucrats often brutally applied the expulsion policy, but it was usually in some such local affair as the wholesale expulsion of the New York carpenters in 1916 by Hutchinson. It remained for Sigmund of the ILGWU, patterning after the methods of the Amsterdam International, to introduce in our trade union movement the use of expulsion as a settled policy against political opponents in the unions, in cooperation with the Forward Machine in New York. Hundreds were driven out of the unions in various cities. This culminated in 1925 in the expulsion of the entire executive boards of the three big locals, numbers 2, 9, 22, with about 35,000 members. Result, a mass uprising, the formation of the Joint Action Committee of the expelled bodies, and the temporary defeat of Sigmund and his expulsion policy. In the needle trades, the expulsion campaign had reached its high point. Sigmund of the ILGWU, partially recovered from his defeat of 2 years ago, and supported actively by the AFL leaders, the employers, the police, and the press, has arbitrarily expelled some 40,000 members of the New York Joint Board. This splits his union and threatens it with destruction. It is deadly to the workers' organization and to union conditions in the shops. The bosses have slashed wages on all sides. Following the suicidal policy of Sigmund, the leaders of the Furriers Union, who are mere catspaws of the employers and of Wool and Green, have expelled the New York Joint Board of their organization. It has some 10,000 members, or 3/4 of the membership of their entire union. Wholesale expulsions are also being prepared for other cities. The two expelled joint boards, banded together under the Unity Committee, are now fighting for readmission into their unions. The slogan of the right-wing AFL leaders and their socialist allies is to get rid of the left wing even if the unions concerned are destroyed in the struggle. The very life of unionism in the needle industry is at stake in this desperate effort to suppress union democracy and to force the workers back under the arbitrary dictation of the reactionary leaders, which means under the control of the employers. A form of terrorism now at a high pitch in the trade union movement is the so-called red baiting. Red baiting consists of terrifying the ideologically backward union membership with frightful stories of the Red Menace, and thus stampeding them into supporting the reactionaries. The extent to which this is practiced and the means used to accomplish it are almost unbelievable. Soviet Russia, Bolshevism, communism, boring from within. These are magic words in the mouths of the labor fakers. Around them they build plots and sinister conspiracies at which even a white guard propagandist would shamefacedly blush. Systematically, they play upon the weaknesses of the workers, their religion, patriotism, and petty bourgeois notions generally. Russian gold, to hear the reactionary union leaders tell it, flows freely in the dastardly attempt of the left-wingers to destroy all that is good and holy in society. Practically all trade union journals and conventions, from the AFL down, now have as regular features such slanders. The reactionaries first picture a terrible red menace and then, identifying all progressive proposals with it, scare away the more timid delegates. They make, in the minds of many, such elementary issues as amalgamation, the Labor Party, and the organization of the unorganized, synonymous with Bolshevism. Result? The right-wing delegates are whipped into fascist-like frenzy and are made ready for any violence, such as the mobbing of Joseph Manley, A. Wagenknecht, and others at the Scranton 1923 convention of the anthracite miners. The middle group, or progressives, usually wither under the fiery blast. One of the most deplorable features of present-day trade union conventions is that these progressives, terrorized by the attacks of the reactionaries, commonly vote against such issues as the Labor Party, amalgamation, etc. Lacking the courage and aggressiveness to bring in such measures themselves, the progressives are afraid to vote for them when the left wing proposes them, for fear of being identified with the communists. These misleaders of labor do not hesitate, however, when hard pressed, to proceed to much more violent methods. American trade union bureaucrats, especially in the building trades, stand quite apart from union leaders in any other country in the use of physical force to control the workers' organizations. Their methods often approach those of the Italian fascists. Chicago offers classical examples. Crime here takes on a terror and violence without a parallel in any other American city. The spectacular gunfights and murder campaigns between the bootlegging gangs, which, carried on with machine guns, armored cars, bombs, and other implements of modern warfare, have cost the lives of about 200 men in the past 2 years, are typical of the ruthless spirit of such elements. The reactionary Chicago labor leaders are saturated with this same reckless violence. The union official positions are rich prizes. They mean wealth and power to the corruptionists, and the latter do not hesitate before the most violent means in order to secure and hold them. Consequently, there has developed a regular school of labor gunmen, typified by such elements as Madden, Enright, Murphy, and scores of others. For many years, these toughs, with their bodyguards and armed cliques, have terrorized numerous Chicago unions. The wars between these gangs for control have been many and murderous. During the past 20 years, scores of men have been killed in such union feuds, some being secretly assassinated, and others shot down in open fights in saloons and union halls. Seldom are these reactionary leaders punished for such crimes, so powerful are their connections with corrupt politicians. The armed cliques of reactionaries war against each other for control of the unions, but they always unite when they are confronted with an upheaval among their rank and file. They have made democracy a farce in many Chicago unions. And what is true of Chicago unions in this respect is true likewise, to a lesser degree, of unions in all big industrial centers. A few typical incidents from scores of such in Chicago's lurid inter-union feuds illustrate the methods of these gunmen. Thus, the killing of Charles Victor a few years ago at the Painters District Council by T. Shepler, a bureaucrat gunman, said the Chicago Daybook of the fight. Shortly before the meeting adjourned, Victor jumped on his chair and fired at Shepler. The rush and shouts of the men trying to escape from the hall almost drowned the fusillade of shots. Shepler stood up. His gun, which had been hanging in a holster on his belt, flashed. Victor tottered and fell headlong from the chair. Blood gushed from his mouth. He shivered and lay still. Shepler sat down heavily. When the police arrived, Victor was dead. At the Iroquois Hospital, Shepler found out to be shot in the right arm and leg. Another bullet gashed the left side of his head. Thus operates democracy among the painters, Gomper's style. Here is how the reactionary Teamsters Union officials settled their disputes, as reported in the Chicago Tribune, January 13, 1921. South Chicago teaming concerns were under heavy police guard last night following a pitched battle between members of two rival Teamsters unions at 95th Street and Escanaba Avenue early yesterday morning. The battle, during which more than 200 shots were fired, was fought from 8 automobiles. Several men are said to have been wounded in the engagement, but they were spirited away by their companions in automobiles and their names were not learned. No truce has been adopted as the slogan of both sides, and sluggers were being recruited last night by both unions. Or take a commonplace note from Cleveland labor history. On May 31, 1924, as W. M. O'Brien, Second International Vice President of the Sheet Metal Workers, and J. Nestor, business agent of the sheet metal workers, in company with other officials, were leaving the union meeting, the automobile in which they were riding was bombed by opposing factionalists. Nestor was killed and O'Brien maimed for life. It was never learned who did this job. The New York Socialist Needle Trade Unions, like many other New York unions, are also infested with such terrorists. Many of them are connected to the criminal underworld gangs, headed by Little Augie, Jack Noy, Frenchie, etc. Usually these plug uglies first establish connections with the needle unions during the strikes, because instead of developing the militancy of the strikers themselves in such struggles, the right-wing officials commonly called upon the gangsters to man the picket lines. This enabled these corrupt elements to worm their way into the unions and often into official positions. Their influence upon the unions has been poisonous. With the development of the present struggle between the right and left wings in the New York needle trade unions, the reactionary officials have called into their service all these gangster connections. These, with full police protection, are carrying on an open terroristic campaign, slugging pickets, terrorizing meetings, and beating up left-wingers. At times, the conflicts between the opposing forces take on the aspects of pitched battles. The widespread use of such reactionary control methods by the labor bureaucrats gives the lie effectively to those apologists who assert that the reactionary AFL officialdom is a true reflection of the backward rank and file in the unions. These misleaders are by no means the free choice of the organized workers. To a very great extent, they force themselves upon the unions by means of selling out the unskilled, accepting assistance from the employers and the state, and by the arbitrary suppression of union democracy. For the time being, with the industrial crisis not yet very keen and masses of workers somewhat lulled by relatively steady work during the capitalist prosperity, these autocratic methods of control stand the reactionary bureaucrats in good stead and make it very difficult for the left wing and progressive forces to unite the rank and file for effective action against their false leaders and the employers. But ample experience has demonstrated that despite all this terrorism and suppression of democracy, substantial results can be achieved in educating and organizing the masses, and the basis can be laid for real progress in the unions. And as the industrial crisis sharpens and the working masses are forced to lower living standards, such autocratic methods will be less and less effective. The rank and file, driven to revolt by hard economic conditions and an awakening class consciousness, will break through every autocratic restriction laid upon them by their misleaders and will build their unions into the militant, powerful organizations that they should be. 1927. That's the end of chapter 14. Thank you everyone for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Hope you're all doing well.